A warm welcome to Diplomatic Channel. I am Amarachi Ubani. This week, we're all about the COP27 summit in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. We'll bring you updates on the summit so far. Plus, my guest, Ambassador Ayola Olukanni's views of the climate summit so far, Nigeria's efforts in mitigating climate change, and how Nigeria can be at the forefront of tackling climate change in Africa. That's Diplomatic Channel in a wrap. Let's check in on other discussions in diplomatic circles, and we'll be right back.
On ensuring
Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has blamed Russia for global economic woes and intends to raise the issue at the G20 summit holding in Indonesia. Leaders will be arriving in Indonesia this weekend for the G20 summit, and the global economy as well as the Russian invasion of Ukraine are expected to dominate discussions.
Because the biggest question that we are facing in the world right now as a global economy is in part the instability that flows from Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, the energy crisis that has flowed from it, the inflation crisis that has flowed from it, the food crisis that has flowed from Russia's illegal actions. It's important as a G20 we work together to deal with threats to the global economy.
Meanwhile, world leaders are attending the Association of Southeast Asian Nations in Cambodia. Present on Sunday were leaders of South Korea, Japan, China, Australia, and New Zealand, along with the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. British Defence Secretary Ben Wallace says Ukraine has the momentum in its war with Russia, but that Moscow is a long way from giving up. Wallace said Russia's withdrawal from Kherson, the only regional capital in Ukraine that it had captured since its invasion began in February, was another setback for its army, but Moscow continued to pose a threat.
Developing countries are once again calling on richer nations to honor their commitments made previously at other climate conferences, one of which is the $100 billion a year to vulnerable states hit by increasing severe climate-linked impacts and disasters. Countries also want main carbon emitters to better commit to reducing those emissions, keeping them honest at the protesters at COP27.
Must accelerate their transition.
African leaders at the COP27 summit in Sharm el-Sheikh have been trying to follow the money on financial promises made in the past summits. Egyptian President Fattah al-Sisi said it was important that African countries receive appropriate support and funding, according to the principle of shared responsibilities and burdens. Back in 2009, developed countries promised that by 2020, they would transfer $100 billion per year to vulnerable states hit by increasingly severe climate-linked impacts and disasters. That goal is expected to be reached by next year, 3 years late. According to Senegalese President and AU Chairman Macky Sall, COP27 is an opportunity to make history by shouldering and honoring the commitments, including the $100 billion to support adaptation efforts for developing countries. For the first time, the issue of loss and damage is part of the formal negotiations.
Our continent will need a predictable, appropriate, and at-scale funding stream and technological support. This must support our right to development, international equity and transmissions that are just and inclusive. This then places a great deal of responsibility on developed economies to honor their commitments to those countries with the greatest need and countries that confront the greatest environmental, social, and economic effects of climate change.
Climate change protesters seem to echo what leaders were saying inside. Marching around the COP27 venue, they called for urgent action towards climate finance and loss and damage.
We need a loss and damage finance facility to ensure climate reparations from the global north to the global south. And we need drastic carbon dioxide emission cuts. We need to phase out the fossil fuel industry in a just transition. All of this and more is so important in securing human security and human safety.
Back inside, U.S. President Joe Biden told delegates he has had unwavering commitments to climate issues and that his administration was working to strengthen accountability for climate risk and resilience.
We're proving that good climate policy is good economic policy. It's a strong foundation for durable, resilient, inclusive economic growth. It's driving progress in the private sector. It's driving progress around the world.
The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency says the primary source of greenhouse gas emission in the country are transportation, electricity production, industry, commercial and residential, agriculture, and land use and forestry. Meanwhile, on Saturday, African countries again called for more climate adaptation finance to increase food production. Food insecurity and climate change are major challenges in Africa. Extreme weather patterns and drought have had serious impact, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, which is heavily reliant on grain-fed agriculture. Officials will call for more efforts to help the farmers adapt to climate consequences so that they can be better protected. Experts believe that the right affordable financial scheme, good agriculture practices and proper governance policies, Africa not only has the ability to feed itself, but also the world. Joining me now is Ambassador Ayola Olukanni, a career diplomat with 35 years of service at the Nigerian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He served in Nairobi as acting permanent representative to the United Nations Environment Programme, UNEP, served in Nigerian missions in Vienna, Australia, New Zealand, Fiji, Papua New Guinea, and Vanuatu. Among his many serving capacities, he holds a master's degree in international law and diplomacy, with focus on evolution of international environmental law and international environmental diplomacy. He has been part of several COPs of the UNFCCC and the Kyoto Protocol and has been involved in the drafting of the Basel Convention on Transboundary Movement of Hazardous Waters and their disposal. Ambassador Olukanni is currently associate member of the Nigerian Montane Forest Program at the Ngel Inyaki Forest in Taraba State and is also vice president of foremost Nigerian environment NGO Fight Against Desert Encroachment. This is only a bit of the many boards and committees that he currently sits on. Ambassador Olukanni, thank you so much for joining me on Diplomatic Channel.
Thank you very much, Marachi. I feel highly honored to be here.
Well, we're glad to have you. And what an interesting conversation we're about to have with COP27 ongoing at Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt.
Well, it's very interesting, really, and I'm indeed very glad that these COPs continue every year. It's a reflection of the importance of the climate change issue. And the question we'll ask ourselves is, where will the human race be without these international processes, especially the various COPs of the UNFCCC?
Yeah, and you were part of the Kyoto Protocol. You've also attended a few COPs yourself. You've been in the groups, in the committees that actually make the decisions, the ones that draft the policies and so on. You have made contributions in that regard. Do you see any difference between, the ones you've attended in the past and this COP27 currently taking place?
Well, essentially, there's not been too many differences as well. You have these discussions on key issue declarations, then the various arrangements of how to tackle issues of global common, like the climate change issue, like the environment issue. What we have seen is that the respective COPs of the Conference of Parties under UNFCCC, just like in many of the other COPs, is a reflection of the urgency, the importance as far as this is concerned, and the fact that we are having it every year. I know some people will say, oh, really, these UN people have gone again to go and talk. What are they doing about action? But the fact that we are continuing on the various COPs is a reflection of the fact that indeed there is an urgent job at hand. Opening his remarks in Sharm el-Sheikh, the UN Secretary General said the human race is on the way to hell, climate hell. Well, that may be a little bit dramatic, But I think what we've seen around us, the various floods, the number of people who are killed.
The heat waves this year.
Yes, it's a reflection of the importance of how urgent the task is. But the question is, while we are thinking global, we have to act local. I mean, this is not me saying it. This is somebody who has talked about the question of tackling the environment issues. You think globally, but you act local. And I think in Nigeria, should be at the heart of the matter in terms of what we should do as far as the climate change issue itself is concerned.
So we're talking about international environmental diplomacy, and where does that leave Nigeria? I know that we've had a few committees. We have had the International Panel on Climate Change.
Yes.
We've also had, some government committees looking into climate change. I mean, the president himself recently, told the Ministry of Environment to look into, the floods and all of that, and mitigating climate change and so on. But where really are we going with the conversation here in this part of the world?
Well, I think if we go back in history in terms of involvement of Nigeria, the major point, the reference point, of course, would be the UN Commission on Environment and Development, the Brundtland Report, which spoke about the question and issues of the environment, pointed attention to the crisis we're facing. Nigeria was represented on that commission, our common future, in terms of the question of the environment. Fast forward to the International Conference on Environment and Development, which was held in Rio, the Rio Earth Summit. I was lucky to have been in New York as part of those who prepared for that very coming. It was that conference that recommended that most countries should have a Ministry of Environment. So we had a small little department in the Ministry of Works and Housing and Environment. At the end of the day, when we came back from Rio, we eventually created the Ministry of Environment. This is a reflection how much important this is for Nigeria and how we've, of course, acted on that. That is a very positive development which we have as far as the question of environment issue is concerned. And don't forget the climate change issue is just one of the thematic areas of the environment. We have the CBD Convention on Biodiversity, we have the desertification issue, we have the question of land degradation, we have the issues of air pollution, on and on and on. But the climate change issue seems to be one of the ones that has demonstrated the possible dangers if we do not have sustainable development, if we not take on the question and issues of environment. I'm indeed very glad that we've done that, and by creating the Ministry of Environment. And don't forget, we used to have FEPA. It was FEPA that was upgraded to the Ministry of Environment. And since we now have the Ministry of Environment, now we say we need a functional implementing arm that will also deal with regulations. And that's where and how NESRIA itself came in. And then, of course, we, of course, have moved away from that in terms of the question of that to focus on the climate change itself by establishing the National Council on Climate Change. It's good to establish all these institutions.
Yeah, you want to talk about the achievements of that.
The question is, an issue is the impact that we'll have. And that is where the challenge is always is. Don't forget Paris, COP21, COP22, last time it was in Glasgow. A lot of funds were mentioned, $1 billion in terms of, and if you go back in history, you will remember that from Rio, after the conference in Rio, where we had adopted, we had 3 conventions, the 3 Rio Convention on the UNFCCC Framework Convention, which is dealing with climate change issue, the Convention on Desertification, and the Convention on Biodiversity. We also had what we refer to as the GEF, the Global Environment Facility, in terms of money to be put down to be able to tackle the issues of it. But like we said, the challenge is how can we make sure that all these funds that are announced, that people can tap into those funds and then, of course, implement them. It reminds me of the famous saying of Mario Cuomo, which I'm very fond of, the former mayor of New York, who talks about you campaign in poetry, but you govern in prose. You campaign in poetry, you govern in prose. So when we go to Sharm el-Sheikh, when we're in Paris and we talk about the question of the climate change, adaptation issues and things like that, the question is implementation. And that is where the challenge is. And hopefully when we come back from after the end of this COP, the Sharm el-Sheikh, the question of implementation. And I have been involved a little bit on that, and I know how challenging it is.
Not much we have seen on the Nigerian side, what they have said so far, what they're representing. So what sort of contribution do you think the Nigerian team is making to the conversation in Sharm el-Sheikh?
I think Nigeria is part and parcel of the group of developing countries, people, those of us from the South, who are engaging counterparts. Those of them who will say that are the one who had polluted the earth in terms of the carbon emission, in terms of the industrial path which it all. So Nigeria is part and parcel of that process in terms of what exactly engaging the other side in terms of the question, what percentage are we contributing? Because if you look at it, there's the question of those of us who are contributing less, not minuscule, to the whole question of climate change, carbon issues, and things like that. You know, climate change and warming up the earth. But the impact on us is huge, and that's why Nigeria is part and parcel of the group. At various levels, the group of 77, the various group within the framework of the COPs itself, in terms of what exactly can be done. So we're out there in terms of engaging, and especially Nigeria has a key role to play within the framework of the African group as far as the debate on the climate change itself is concerned. I can give an example of some of the things which happened. You know, I was part and parcel of the Basel Convention, which you mentioned, and I remember COP8 of the Basel. I was in Nairobi in Kenya. It coincided. COP8 of Basel coincided with the period when the Probo Koala, Transfigura, dumped toxic waste in Abidjan. And then in the morning, people woke up and people were dying. People were being affected. So when we got to Nairobi and the discussion started, the question of the issue of the Probo Koala was not on the agenda of that COP. Nigeria led the team to say, look, listen, you cannot discuss this question of COP8 as far as Basel is concerned. A vessel has been accused. Some companies have dumped waste in Côte d'Ivoire, and people are dying. So I remember very well, it was our delegation that forced the question and issues on the agenda of COP8. And of course, that was where the question of electronic waste was also put on the agenda of Basel. So we play but I think the most important thing is when we finish these COPs, these COPs, the whole question of environmental diplomacy, international environmental diplomacy, is what is going on there now. Right. But what do we do when we come back home? And that's going to be the challenge at the end of the day.
Yeah, because, you know, last year, I think they had agreed that the Earth had warmed an extra 1.5 degrees Celsius, and that, of course, we need to do more. The latest UN report does mention that the last 8 years have been the hottest.
Yes.
And, of course, you mentioned that the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, also says...
We're on the way to climate hell.
We're way to climate hell. And then the UN report also mentions, you know, what's going to happen in the near future. In about 10 years, it says this Earth will really, really be warm. So how can we prepare for that?
I think what we should do at home here, and I'm speaking as somebody who was involved in drafting some of this convention. I mentioned the Basel Convention. We should be focused on the outcome and then put together action. Take, for example, we have the Ecological Fund. We have the Ecological Fund.
It's been a long time I heard that.
Yes, well, the Ecological Fund, the question and issue of the Ecological Fund is also there. I think it's going as far as 3.1% of the national budget every year.
Well, where is it now?
Yeah, that's a question we asked.
Well, I'm asking you.
Well, you're asking me. I used to know that at the beginning, the Ecological Fund was in the Ministry of the Environment. There's somewhere along the line, it found its way to the presidency. The question we are asking is, should that be the case? We are now saying that we've established the National Council on Climate Change. And the council itself is supposed to also raise funds in terms of climate action at the local level. Because we must domesticate, we must make sure that this action is taken at the national. And let me, before we continue, one of the things I want to recommend is that I think we need to professionalize the Ministry of Environment. Not just send admin officers there. We must have people who have studied environmental diplomacy. I mean, the issues of environment itself. Maybe in the area of chemistry, maybe in terms of biodiversity issues, professionals. And let them be professional in that ministry as far as that is concerned. So you will not be posting them up and down from Ministry of Environment, then they are posted to education, and then from... I think that is one thing we need to do. Then secondly, at the state level, the respective state also need to have a program of action in terms of dealing with the question of issues of the environment, or the issues of environment, the climate change issues. I mean, apart from Lagos, I'm not sure we have that does its own climate summit regularly. I'm not sure how many states have this arrangement in terms of, because the institution is necessary to be able to implement the various agreements we come back with from all these COPs.
Yeah, I know one of the things that, poorer countries are asking for at COP27 is they're asking them to revisit the issue of climate adaptation finance. Yeah, they want, the richer countries to actually pay compensation, to the poorer countries for the impacts of climate change in those countries. I want to ask how realistic this is.
Well, in the area of international environmental diplomacy, you don't limit yourself in terms of what you ask. Negotiations. You ask for this, and then, of course, you see how you can meet yourself somewhere. And that's the nature of diplomacy itself. But international environmental diplomacy itself, of course, and international environmental law has taken a new dimension. This is a new area in terms of the question of, look, you guys, this is what you've done as far as this is concerned. And let us try and see what we can do in terms of getting funds in terms of those. I'm listening to the people who were speaking. I think the UK government itself has put some money down. Maybe is it £1 million thereabout? I think the Netherlands Prime Minister also mentioned, I think, about €1 million. Whatever happens, whatever they promise us, let us accept those funds of money. But it is necessary for us to make sure that when those funds are made available, they are judiciously utilized for those programs. And that's why I was saying that at the federal level, the national level, let us work to professionalize the Ministry of Environment. Then at the state level, let the respective states also have appropriate structures. Even if they don't have the Ministry of Environment, maybe a department that will work. But in fact, I think each state should have a state plan as far as the environment issues itself is concerned.
As we, bring this interview to a close, Nigeria, sometime this year, the president announced net zero carbon emissions by 2060. I wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Well, it's very good to be futuristic. It's very good to take a long view of the future. And I think it's a good thing. I think what we need to do is to have a national action plan in terms of looking at that. I mean, take, for example, the AU is talking about the Agenda 2063, taking a long view of history. I think it's the right action in the right direction. What we need to do is just planning towards that and ensure that at the end of the day, the whole question of carbon credit, carbon emission, we also take advantage of it. And then, of course, I just left as DG NASIMA, the Nigerian Association of Chambers of Commerce, Industry, Mines and Agriculture. I think the private sector should come in and key into all of this. Because out there in Shimashek, the private sector at the national level, at the international level, they're also there. And don't forget, we also have the Global Compact. The Global Compact is part and parcel of the international private sector in terms of the question and issues of the environment, the 11 principles. We should mobilize the Nigerian private sector to be, not only to be part of the discussion, but also to be part of the action as far as the climate change issues and others. Because some of our companies too also, are they involved in sustainable production in terms of the various factories?
We're still very dependent on fossil fuels
if you go around, you will be shocked at some of the smoke billowings in some of these factories. And who is controlling them? NESREA has to write up to the occasion, with the National Environment Standard and Regulation Agency. And then, of course, the National Council on Climate Change, of course, the climate action should also work closely with the private sector in terms of, I'm saying that against the background of my own experience as former DG of NASIMA. And that's why I'm indeed very glad the NASIMA, as well as some of the chambers of commerce, have also try as much as possible, MAN and others, to have their own action plan as far as the climate change issue itself is concerned.
Well, Ambassador Olukanni, maybe we'll talk again when Sharm el-Sheikh is over, with COP27, and then we can look at what has been discussed, what the gains have been, the profits of this summit. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Amarachi.
This is where we end the program this week. Ask yourself, what am I doing to help the environment and climate? You can reach me using any of the social media platforms. On Twitter @Amarachi_Ubani and on Instagram @Amarachi Ubani. I'll see you next time.